In the last video, we talked about Paul especially and how important he was in really trying to figure out what it would mean to follow Jesus, especially now that Jesus was no longer physically present on earth. And there was a great deal of confusion, really, in the early church, a lot of different interpretations about what exactly being a Christian meant. Remember, now we're 2,000 years removed from that time period, and we have 2,000 years of history that help to settle a lot of those possible disputes. So we often take for granted just how much uncertainty there was in the first century, even into the second and third century, about fundamental issues to the Christian faith. Now we do, fortunately, have some things used by the early church to help stabilize the tradition. There was a real possibility that being a follower of Jesus could have resulted in a lot of fragmentation of many different groups who understood what that meant differently. But there were tools that to help stabilize the early church to keep at least a great deal of unity moving forward so that Christianity as an independent and universal tradition could survive. Now, one key figure ultimately in helping stabilize the early church was Marcion. Now, he's an interesting figure because he is remembered historically as one of the first early heretics in the Christian faith. A heretic is someone who is promoting what is viewed as heresy or false belief. So Marcion ends up being seen as a heretic. Now, of course, remember that nobody is generally setting out to be a heretic. Marcion, just like most other heretics of the early church, was simply trying to understand what it meant to follow Jesus to the best of his ability, and he was trying to protect the faith of following Jesus. But Marcion's really interesting because we believe that he was one of the first to actually put forth a list of sacred texts. We've seen the word used in previous videos, a canon. A canon in this sense is just a body of important texts. Remember, the Bible just wasn't magically formed where every time a new letter that ends up in the Bible is written, it gets included in some sort of written document. All kinds of letters and books and gospels were floating around by the end of the first century and into the second century. And about halfway through the second century, Marcion was one of these really key figures who says, you know what? We need to have one agreed upon collection of sacred sources so that now when we have so much uncertainty, at least everyone will have to be arguing from the same agreed upon texts. Unfortunately for Marcion, what he put forth as the canon for the Christian faith was pretty much roundly rejected by most other important leaders in the early Christian church. And it was rejected primarily because Marcion rejected the Hebrew Bible as a portion of the Christian canon. Again, most of you know that the Hebrew Bible, which really gets finalized around 90 CE following the fall of Jerusalem in 70 CE, ends up becoming what Christians will call the Old Testament, the first part of the Christian Bible. Marcion rejected the Hebrew Bible as part of the Christian canon. He actually didn't believe that there was any real theological connection between biblical Judaism and the Christian faith, right? In some ways, he was taking Paul's effort to show how Judaism was teaching works and Christianity was teaching faith and grace and kind of driving a wedge between the two traditions. Marcion was taking that to an extreme, saying there's actually no connection whatsoever. For Marcion, in some ways, it was just coincidental that Jesus happened to be Jewish because Jesus wasn't really a connecting point back to biblical Judaism. Marcion said, look, when I read the Hebrew Bible, I see a God of wrath and anger and violence. And when I hear Jesus, I hear about a God of love and mercy and grace. Marcion says these aren't the same pictures of God, and therefore we should not include the Hebrew Bible as part of the Christian Bible. He also rejected Matthew's gospel because, again, if you'll remember, Matthew's gospel was seemingly addressed to a Jewish audience trying to connect Jesus to the Hebrew scriptures and the prophecies that are found there. So he edited some versions of other gospels, included Paul's letters generally, but that was his attempt at producing a canon for the Christian faith. It ends up being rejected by, again, most of the church leaders, but it did encourage the church in some ways to have the conversation and to actually work harder at collecting and compiling those letters and books and gospels that should be viewed as authoritative for the Christian faith. It will still take another century or so, really into the 3rd century, and really doesn't get officially determined until the beginning of the 4th century for there to be an official, final, formal Christian Bible. But the work really becomes much more rapid after Marcion's heresy through the 3rd century with some other attempts at a Christian Bible, and really everything comes together for the vast majority of Christians, and especially the Christian leaders, by the end of the 3rd century. So the formation of a canon becomes really helpful in stabilizing the early church. Now, everyone who's going to try to make an argument about what it means to follow Jesus will need to defend that argument from these agreed upon books within the Christian Bible. Okay? We'll mention another important stabilizing factor in a second, but first I want to mention another early heresy in the Christian faith. And there was kind of an umbrella term that is Gnosticism, that really represented many different types of what were eventually seen by church leaders as early heresies. Again, it doesn't mean that Gnosticism is radically defeated or that there aren't still Gnostic tendencies that show up throughout the history of the Christian faith, but many important figures in the early church did try to condemn various Gnostic beliefs as heretical. Now, Gnosticism is generally just about this kind of secret knowledge. That's what the word actually means, coming from the Greek word gnosis, a kind of secret knowledge. So many of the Gnostics said, great, you have your Bible, but we've been given a kind of secret knowledge that tells us more truth than what you have at your disposal. And one general theme within many of the Gnostic groups was a kind of dualism between spirit and matter. For most Gnostics, spirit was good and matter was evil. Right? This actually becomes clearer with one particular group that might be lumped under this Gnostic umbrella, and this was the group that promoted what we call Docetism. The Docetics, preaching Docetism, those terms come from a word that means to appear. And what Docetism put forth was that because the material world was inherently evil, then Jesus, as a perfect being, could have only appeared to be fully human. He couldn't have actually maintained flesh in his existence, or else he would have been corrupted by the evil nature of materiality, of physicality. Now again, Docetism, as well as many other Gnostic groups, end up being condemned as heretical by many within the early church. Especially Docetism was condemned because most Christians did believe that Jesus was really a physical being. He wasn't just, as the Docetics taught, a kind of illusion, like a really cool magic trick. No, he was real. He was flesh. People could touch him, and that was important to them, and therefore they had to condemn Docetism. Plus, most early Christians were affirming that all of creation was made by God, and specifically through the Logos, who becomes Christ. And therefore, just brushing with his broad stroke that all materiality is evil had to be condemned, because ultimately, no matter how prevalent sin and evil might be, everything that exists, including materiality, the physical world, ultimately was created as good and will eventually be redeemed. And that was important for many in the early church, which is why some of these heresies were also condemned. Again, we don't need to focus so much on all the different heretical positions. What's important mostly for us is just to realize how much diversity and complexity there was in these early centuries of the Christian faith, as so many different groups were competing for the right way to understand the religion that was based on Jesus Christ. Now, again, another important tool used by the early church to stabilize itself, to maintain a sense of unity despite all of this inconsistency, uncertainty, and diversity, was what we could call the structure of leadership that developed. And there was a very interesting structure of leadership. Some of the terms used, like priest, like deacon, even bishops, some of these are actually found in the New Testament time period itself. But the way those offices get understood changes a little bit as we move into the 2nd century. And the key office, really to help stabilize the early church, was the office of the bishop. And a bishop came to be understood as an overseer of a territory of local churches, right? It comes from this Greek word episkopoi, which is why we refer to this as the Episcopacy, or an episcopal structure of leadership, a structure of leadership based on the role of bishops. That way, if there was a debate within a particular church or between a couple of local churches, immediately you could take that debate to the bishop who oversaw the local church, and the bishop could help mediate the debate. And then obviously, if the debates grew larger, hopefully all bishops could come together and maintain a sense of unity. So the bishops became very important and continue to be an important office of leadership for many within the Christian tradition, especially Roman Catholics and Anglicans or Episcopalians and so on. Now, early on, we had what were referred to as the 4 patriarchs of the early church. And by the time we reach the 4th century, we add a 5th patriarch. In other words, these are the bishops that are seen as perhaps more important than all other bishops because of where their offices are located, and sometimes due to the heritage of that particular office, the lineage back to the apostolic time period. So you had the Bishop of Jerusalem, who was an early patriarch of the faith. That makes sense. Think of how central Jerusalem was to the life of Jesus and to the beginnings of the early church. The Bishop of Antioch in modern-day Syria was an early important office of leadership in the church, moving a little bit further east from Jerusalem, where you had a very strong early contingent of committed Christians. You had the Bishop of Alexandria in modern-day Egypt. Again, the Christian faith, as it begins to extend beyond the historic Holy Lands, is going to really make a lot of important moves to the east and also to the south into Egypt. And then you had the Bishop of Rome, and this is obviously further out to the west, all the way over there to modern-day Italy, at Rome, which was obviously a central location within the Roman Empire. And the Bishop of Rome was an especially interesting office because fairly early on, the tradition taught that Peter eventually found himself in Rome and could be considered the first bishop of Rome. Now, maybe that title wasn't technically used at that time in history. Scholars and theologians can debate some of this. But clearly he was present in Rome, and many Christians started to see him as really the first leader of the Roman churches in and around Rome. And therefore, those who are holding that office later in time, especially in the early church, start to view themselves as the successors of Peter. And if you remember, if you're familiar with the Gospels, there's a really key moment where at one point, Peter, whose original name was Simon, confesses that Jesus is the Messiah. And at that point, Jesus says, "You will no longer be called Simon, you are now called Peter." And it comes from the Greek word that means a rock. And then Jesus says, "And on this rock I will build my church." Right? Obviously, that's a confusing passage. If you are familiar with the Roman Catholic tradition, you know that there is a strong belief that Jesus meant that on Peter himself and his successors would the church be built. If you are familiar more with many Protestant interpretations, then Jesus was talking more about Peter's confession rather than Peter himself or any office that he might eventually hold and the successors of that office. But early on, even that connection with Peter made the Bishop of Rome an important office within the early church and the fourth of those major patriarchs. Now, eventually, we will get the Patriarch of Constantinople further over in the east again, but we won't get a Patriarch of Constantinople until Constantine moves the capital of the Roman Empire to Constantinople, names that city after himself, and then you have that as such a central city that the bishop of that city does become viewed as the fifth patriarch of the early church. So you have the formation of the Bible as an important early stabilizing tool, at this time of uncertainty. And you also have the formation of the structure of leadership around the office of the bishops as an important stabilizing tool. What might be considered and has been considered by some scholars a third important early tool used by the church to stabilize itself was the development of creeds. And these were short statements of the faith that helped to teach new converts about the fundamental elements of the Christian faith. They were used in liturgies or worship services to remind old believers about the faith, and they also were used to help defend the faith against possible heresies. And in the next couple of videos, we will start getting into a discussion of the Council of Nicaea, where we will see the Nicene Creed being composed. And that will be a good example of how creeds were used as important tools to stabilize the church, to try to maintain a sense of unity when there was so much uncertainty and so much diversity in what it actually meant to follow Jesus as we make our way through the 2nd and 3rd and into the 4th centuries.